This is Jason Weatherly, and this is a sermon lesson I put together on 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the issue of headship, head covering, and hair. I presented this lesson in May of 2018 at the Bethlehem Church at Potts Camp, Mississippi, where my fellow UGST student and good friend Jonathan Vasquez is the pastor. Now, back in February of 2018, I had the privilege of engaging in a public debate with an apostolic brother on the issue of 1 Corinthians 11 and head coverings. I prepared over 200 PowerPoint charts for that debate, most of which we did not even have time to discuss. And that debate is on YouTube, and I'll put a link to that debate in the description. There were many ministers of various apostolic organizations at that debate, and they impressed upon me after the debate was over, because of the amount of charts that we did not even begin to discuss. They asked me if I would put those charts into book form and self-publish it, and I did. And the name of that book is A Woman's Glory, a look at headship, head coverings, and hair. And it's available on Amazon. And I'll also put a link to that book in the comments or in the description of this video. So I wanted to put this lesson out there on 1 Corinthians 11. Basically, it is an exegesis through 1 Corinthians 11, 3 through 15, and it's in sort of a debate or apologetic style. At times, I will refer to what is commonly called the second covering doctrine, which teaches that women are required to wear some sort of second material covering over their hair during prayer or worship time. And there's a lot of material that's going to be covered in this lesson, so you'll have the opportunity to go back and re-watch it, re-look at the charts, and take your time in studying this very important issue. One thing I do want to say at the very outset, because I'm not going to have the time to get into it, but one of the main arguments made by the proponents of the second covering doctrine is that the is church history. They love to quote the writings of Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, who was the father of Trinitarianism, and John Chrysostom, all who mention women wearing veils. In fact, every book that I've read that promotes a second covering for women dedicates at least half of their book to church history. They act like that just because a handful of early church writers taught that women should wear veils, that this means that all Christian women of that time wore veils, or that nobody taught that a woman's hair was the covering. The Wikipedia article on head coverings even boasts that women unanimously wore head coverings. Now, do you realize how ridiculous that statement is? Women have never unanimously done anything, men either for that part. So it's very irresponsible to take a few Catholic writings and claim that these represent the entirety of ancient Jesus name apostolic churches, especially a guy like Tertullian, who was violently opposed to the one person modalistic view of the Godhead. Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament points out that the veiling of women in church history was not universally obeyed. Only some of the orantes, or the catacomb drawings of people praying, depict women as wearing veils. Mary and other holy women were often depicted without veils. Tertullian had to write a special work on the veiling of virgins. Tertullian spoke in several places of various churches where both married women and virgins worshiped without wearing a veil. And in Pseudo Ambrose, the veil was an obligatory ornament only for the dedicated virgin, so that a distinction could be made between those dedicated and not dedicated. And Kittles concludes that this is how the matter remained in the church at large. So wearing veils was not a universal practice. And I have so much more information on the history of veils versus long hair in my book, A Woman's Glory. So when we talk about the head covering issue, or men and women's hair, we often relate this to the holiness issue. And it is a matter of holiness and gender distinction and all of that. But the main reason why this is important is because the head covering, whatever it is in direct relationship to headship, as Paul laid the foundation in 1 Corinthians 11:3. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. The word head or kephale in Greek has reference to someone in a superior rank, a chief or a leader. The word head refers to someone who is in authority over someone else. It is used this way many times in the Septuagint Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. Bauer Danker Art Gingrich, page 542, says that the word kephale refers to a being of high status, head, figuratively, in the case of a living being, to denote superior rank of the husband in relation to his wife. So the word head here does not refer to source as is commonly purported. The word source, or the idea that kephale means source, comes from some very questionable classical Greek sources. And the argument that head means source is very circular in its argument. Commentators quote other commentators who quote other commentators. They never go back to the actual classical Greek writings to take a look at those and see if it really means source. However, in the Septuagint, in the Greek Old Testament, the word kephale, head, is never used metaphorically for source. And the Septuagint is the mother of the New Testament, grammatically speaking. So, by that same token, the word head, kephale, in the New Testament is never metaphorically used to denote source. In the Septuagint, when the Hebrew word rosh, head, refers to the source of something, such as the source or the head of a river, the Septuagint translates the word rosh with the Greek word arche, which means beginning. But the word kephale, head, always, when it's used metaphorically, refers to someone in a position of leadership or authority. For example, kephale is used to describe Jephthah as the head or captain over Gilead. Kephale is used to describe David when he prayed that God would make him the head or ruler over the heathens. In Isaiah 7:8 through 9, kephale is used to describe both the capital or the ruling city of a province and also the ruler of that capital city. In Jeremiah 31:7, kephale refers to Israel as being the head or chief of the nations. And then in Lamentations 1:5, kephale describes the adversaries who became the chief over Jerusalem through her captivity. In the New Testament, Paul says in Ephesians 1:22 and Colossians 2:10 that Christ through Calvary is made the head, the kephale, the authority over all things. In Ephesians 4:15 and Colossians 1:18, Christ is the head of the church, meaning Christ is the one we obey. And in Ephesians 5:23, Paul used this identical language as 1 Corinthians 11:3, where he says that wives are to submit themselves to their own husbands because the husband is the head, the kephale of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and the church is subject to Christ. So here we definitely see that there is an idea of the head being in a position of authority, and those others, the wife is to submit to her head, the church is to submit to its head, which is Christ. So in 1 Corinthians 11:3, Paul is dealing with the issue of headship or someone who is in authority over someone else, specifically the husband as the head or authority over his wife. And the head covering, whatever it is a symbol of our submission to our head. As one writer put it, the head covering is the object lesson of our headship. In 1 Corinthians 11:4, Paul states, every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head. This phrase, having his head covered, is more of a commentary than a translation. The phrase, having his head covered, in Greek is kata kephiles ekon, which literally translated is having something down from his head. You'll notice that there is no direct object given in this verse. What that something is not specifically stated in the text. So the phrase kata kephiles ekon in and of itself does not tell us specifically what it is that a man is not to have down from his head. This has to be determined from the context. Some may say, well, you see, Brother Weatherly, this passage means that a man is not to wear a hat when he prays. Well, I want you to keep in mind that in the Old Testament, the priests and Levites commonly prayed and prophesied wearing a mitre or a turban. It was part of their required uniform. They were commanded by God to wear this garment on top of their head. Take, for example, Zacharias, John the Baptist's father, in Luke 167. When he prophesied in the temple, he was required to wear this hat or turban on the top of his head. Even Orthodox Jewish men were required to wear a prayer shawl on their head during prayer and worship time in the temple or synagogue. So either they were dishonoring their heads every time they prayed and prophesied wearing a turban or a prayer shawl, or 1 Corinthians 11:4 is not talking about a hat or some kind of fabric covering on our head. Somebody says, yeah, but Brother Weatherly, that's the Old Testament, and 1 Corinthians 11:4 is in the New Testament. Well, thank you. I'm glad that you brought that up. The Jewish apostles after Calvary continued in temple and synagogue prayer and worship. Luke 24:53 and Acts 2:46, they were continually in the temple worshiping and blessing God. And Acts 3 and 1, Peter and John went to the temple at the hour of prayer. Acts 13:14, Paul and Barnabas entered into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Acts 17:10, Paul and Silas were in the synagogue. How did these Jewish apostles participate in prayer in the temple or the synagogue without wearing a prayer shawl? The early Jewish church continued to worship in the synagogues. James 2 and 2, when James said, if there come one into your assembly, a man with a gold ring, the word for assembly here is synagoge, which is the Greek word for synagogue. So they were still meeting in the synagogues. In Acts 18:26, it was in the synagogue where Aquila and Priscilla heard Apollos preaching boldly, Acts 19:8. For 3 months, Paul and his company spent their time preaching and debating in the synagogues. These Jewish men would not have been allowed to enter the temple or the synagogue without a prayer shawl. Yet Paul said, if a man prays or prophesies with his head covered, he dishonors his head, thus showing conclusively that a hat, a shawl, or some piece of clothing cannot be the covering Paul was speaking about. Otherwise, the apostles and Jewish men of the early church dishonored their head every time they prayed in the temple and the synagogues. This is just but one of the many reasons why we believe that when Paul said that if a man prays or prophesies having something down his head, that Paul was not talking about a man, or Paul was talking about a man growing long hair. Paul was not talking about wearing a shawl or a hat on top of his head. We believe that Paul was talking about a man growing long hair. That every man praying or prophesying having hair down his head, long hair down his head, dishonors his head. Even the New Strong's Expanded Dictionary of the Bible, page 1167, states in 1 Corinthians 11:4, having his head covered is literally having something down the head, signifying that hair that hangs down is too long for a man. So kata kephiles ekon must be understood in the context of the passage, and we will show you that the context is dealing with hair, that which can be shorn or shaven. 1 Corinthians 11:5, Paul said, but every woman that prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. Now, one of the errors of the second covering doctrine is that they teach that a woman is only required to be covered when she prays or prophesies. However, this is not what the passage says. You can read 1 Corinthians 11:5 from now till Jesus comes, and you'll never find where Paul said that a woman is to be covered only when she prays or prophesies. This is something that has to be read into the text. The phrase praying and prophesying is not a conditional clause, meaning that this is the only time a woman is to be covered, or that this is the only situation in which she dishonors her head by being uncovered. Rather, it is simply an incidental statement, meaning that the statement is accompanying but not a major part of the passage, or that it is something that is simply liable to happen as a consequence of not being covered. For example, if we were to say, if a woman runs barefoot, she dishonors her feet. Does this mean that she dishonors her feet only when she runs barefoot? Or is it possible that she could dishonor her feet by doing other activities while barefooted? If you simply walk barefooted in certain parts of my yard, you will certainly dishonor your feet from all the stickers in the grass. Does this mean that a woman is only required to wear shoes when she is running? Well, obviously not. You try that the next time you go to a restaurant. So if we take praying and prophesying as a conditional clause and not an incidental statement like the second covering doctrine teaches, then what other passages must we understand as conditional clauses? For example, Mark 11:25 says, when you stand praying, forgive, that your Father in heaven may forgive you. Does this mean that we are only to forgive when we stand praying? What if we're sitting down when we pray? Do we not still have to forgive? Or if we are sitting down and we forgive someone, does that mean that the Father's not going to forgive us because we were not standing when we forgave somebody? You see, it's not a conditional clause, it is simply an incidental statement. What about James 5:13? Is any among you suffering? Let him pray. Does this mean that only those who are suffering can pray? So if you are suffering, you can pray. And then when you pray, you need to be standing when you pray, when you suffer and pray, so that you could forgive someone and then you could be forgiven by the Father, right? Or are these simply incidental statements and not conditional clauses? James goes on to say, is any cheerful? Let him sing praises. If we apply the second covering doctrine's logic to 1 Corinthians 11:6 to James 5:13, then if you come to church sad and broken, you don't need to be singing praises, because according to their logic, James 5:13 restricts singing and praise only to those who are cheerful. No, we all understand that's not the case. Each of these, just like 1 Corinthians 11:5 through 6, are incidental statements and not conditional clauses. Also notice this, 1 Corinthians 11:6 through 7, if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. Is it a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven only when she prays or prophesies? Notice this. Since the dishonor of being covered is directly linked to the shame of being shaven, you cannot say that the covering is only required when a woman prays or prophesies. By that same token, you would have to say that it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven only when she prays or prophesies. If not, why not? Paul goes on to say, for a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God. Is man the image and glory of God only when he prays or prophesies? The obvious answer is no. Thus, the covering is not limited to only to when a person prays or prophesies, and it is not limited only to when you are in a church service. 1 Corinthians 11:5, Paul says, but every woman that prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. The word uncovered in Greek is akatakaluptos, from a meaning not, and katakalupto, which means wholly covered or completely covered. So the word akatakaluptos means not fully covered. Once again, the term uncovered in and of itself does not indicate what the covering material is. In fact, Jeremy Gardiner, who is the founder of the head covering movement website, even acknowledges that the words covered and uncovered themselves do not indicate what the material covering is. Jeremy Gardiner says that it does not, these words in and of themselves do not indicate a piece of fabric, but the context tells us what the covering is. And I agree. And we will show you that everything in the context of 1 Corinthians 11:4 through 15 is talking about hair. To uncover the head is a biblical idiom that refers to the hair. Notice in Numbers 5:18 that a woman who was accused of adultery, the priest would set the woman before the Lord and uncover the woman's head. The word uncovered here in Hebrew is parah. Gesenius's Hebrew lexicon, page 690, says that parah comes from the idea of loosening, casting off the garment, and he defines the word as to make naked. For example, the head, Numbers 5:18, especially by shaving. Marvin Vincent states, among the Jews, a woman convicted of adultery had her hair shorn. So we see this idea of uncovering the head relates to a person's hair. Another example is Leviticus 10:6, concerning the death of Nadab and Abihu. Moses told Aaron and his younger sons, do not uncover your heads, neither rend your clothes. We know from other passages that it was common practice in the Old Testament for a man to rend his clothes and shave his head when in mourning. Notice Job 120. Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head. And this is what Aaron and his sons were told not to do. Don't uncover your heads or rend your clothes. So, from Old Testament usage, the idea of uncovering the head refers to hair. Now, the King James Version says in 1 Corinthians 11:5, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. However, I want you to notice that the Greek text, there is no as if statement of comparison. The Greek text literally says, for it is one and the same having been shaven. As a matter of fact, the New King James translates this as one and the same. In other words, for a woman to be uncovered is identical to being shaven. We're not simply talking about something that is simply comparable or similar to. We are talking about something that is one and the same or identical to being shaven. And what is it that is shaven? It's hair. The only way that uncovered can be one and the same thing or identical to being shaven is for the covering material to be hair, that which can be shaven. In 1 Corinthians 11:5, Paul said, "For a woman to be uncovered is one and the same with being shaven." Notice that Paul also used this one and the same phrase in 1 Corinthians 12:11, where the King James translators render it one and the self same Spirit. That's the identical Spirit. So I want you to notice this in both passages. Paul used the identical terms, one and the same. In 1 Corinthians 12:11, Paul wasn't saying that the Spirit who gives a word of knowledge or a word of wisdom is simply comparable or similar to the Spirit that works miracles. No, Paul was saying that it is the identical Spirit that works all the gifts, one and the same, the identical Spirit. One and the same in 1 Corinthians 12:11 means the identical Spirit. Well, Paul used this one and the same language in 1 Corinthians 11:5, just one chapter prior, to describe an uncovered woman as being one and the same or identical with being shaven. Notice how 1 Corinthians 11:15 or 1 Corinthians 11:5 is translated in other Bible versions. The Common English Bible says it is the same thing as having her head shaved. The Holman Christian Standard Bible says, since that is one and the same as having her head shaved. The New International Version translates this, it is the same as having her head shaved. The Concordant Literal Version, for it is one and the same as being shaven. The only way uncovered can be one and the same with shaven is if uncovered has reference to a woman's hair. It has reference to something that can be shaven. 1 Corinthians 11:6, Paul said, "For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered." The phrase, let her even be shorn, is not a command for a woman to cut her hair short. Rather, Paul was saying that this is the logical conclusion or what consistency demands if a woman is not wholly covered. In other words, Paul is making a logical argument. He's saying if you are going to do A, then you might as well do B, which is more severe than A. And since it is a shame to do B, then don't even do A. So if a woman is not fully covered, then she might as well cut her hair short. But since it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. So once again, the context of a woman being covered is dealing with that which can be shorn or shaven, and that is hair. 1 Corinthians 11:6 says, "For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered." The phrase "but if" is not a question of whether or not it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, but it is a rhetorical statement of fact that it is indeed a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven. The phrase but if in Greek is ede. Bauer-Danker lexicon says that this is a marker of condition, of an existing in fact or hypothetical. A.T. Robertson's word pictures, commenting on this passage, says that ede refers to a condition assumed to be true. For example, the phrase ede is also used in Matthew 6:30. Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, shall not he much more clothe you? Which means, since God clothes the field, will he not take care of us? Jesus wasn't questioning whether or not God clothes the fields with grass. He was presenting something as true. Since God clothes the fields with grass. This is the same phrase as in 1 Corinthians 11:6. Since it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven. As a matter of fact, this is exactly how 1 Corinthians 11:6 is translated in several versions. Notice the easy to read version. But it is shameful for a woman to cut off her hair or to shave her head. The English Standard Version says, but since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or to shave her head. The Good News Bible says, and since it is a shameful thing for a woman to shave her head or cut her hair. The Orthodox Jewish Bible says, but since it is in fact a thing of shame for an isha to be shorn or to be shaven. Notice that Paul said that if a woman is not covered, then she might as well be shorn. The word shorn translates the Greek word kero, which means to cut the hair short. The word is used most often for shearing the wool from sheep. Thayer's Greek Lexicon, page 343, says that kero in 1 Corinthians 11:6 absolutely refers to cutting short the hair of the head. Now watch this. Paul's logical argument of consistency takes us from one act to a more severe act. If you're going to do A, then you might as well do B. And B is a more severe act than A. So don't even do A. We might tell our children, if you're going to steal a piece of bubble gum, then you might as well rob a bank. See, we're making a logical argument of consistency by going from one act to a more severe act. If you're going to steal a piece of bubble gum, then you might as well rob a bank. And since robbing a bank is a felony, don't even steal a piece of bubble gum. So we are moving through this logical argument of consistency from one act to a more severe act. This is a logical argument of consistency, and we have equal relationship on both sides of the antithesis. The less severe act of stealing a piece of bubble gum and the more severe act of robbing a bank or stealing money from a bank. Another example of a true antithesis is if a woman goes out in public wearing a halter top, she might as well go out naked. But since it is a shame to go out in public naked, then let her not go out in a halter top. Again, this is a true antithesis because we have equal relationship on both sides. We have partial nudity, then we have full nudity. It's a valid argument because we are trying to explain to you why a woman shouldn't go dressed in public in a halter top. Doing A would logically lead to B, which is a more severe act. And since B is a shame, don't even do A. Now, the second covering doctrine explanation of 1 Corinthians 11:6 is if a woman doesn't wear a veil, she might as well cut her hair short. But since it is a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let her wear a veil. Friends, this is a false antithesis. It does not have equal relationship on both sides of the equation. They're not even similar. It's not even a valid argument. It is totally asinine to say that if a woman doesn't wear a veil, she might as well cut her hair short. This makes about as much sense as saying, if you don't wear sunglasses, you might as well shave your eyebrows. But since it's a shame to shave your eyebrows, you need to wear sunglasses. Both of these are a false antithesis. So Paul said that if a woman is not covered, she might as well cut her hair short. Cutting the hair short is the more severe act. And notice that in the context of being covered, Paul is talking about that which can be shorn or shaven, which is hair. A woman's hair is the context of the passage. In order to have equal relationship in the antithesis, both the covering and that which is shorn must be of the same material. And that material is obviously hair, that which can be shorn or shaven. So if cutting the hair short is the more severe act of logical conclusion, then it stands to reason that the less severe act of a woman not being covered refers to a woman trimming or cutting her hair any length. And by the same token, let her be covered then refers to a woman not cutting her hair at all. So the context of 1 Corinthians 11:6 is, for if the woman trims or cuts her hair any length, she might as well cut her hair short. But since it is a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let the woman not cut her hair at all. Everything in the context deals with the woman's hair. We have equal relationship on both sides of the antithesis. We have the natural flow that the original act leads to a logical consistency demanding a more severe act. Paul's acknowledgement that since the more severe act is a shame or a disgrace to a woman, that she should not even participate in the original act. This argument is both logical and sound. Where the second covering doctrine makes a big mistake is that they do not acknowledge that the word shorn or kero means cut the hair short. So they look at our understanding of the passage as silly and nonsensical and say, well, you say that uncovered means if a woman cuts her hair. So then you would have Paul saying, if a woman cuts her hair, she might as well cut her hair. And that doesn't make any sense. And I agree. But the reason it doesn't make any sense is because they have misunderstood the word shorn. Even in English, if a person was to go to a barber shop and tell the barber, yeah, I'd like for you to shear my hair, which shear is the present tense of shorn, if you told them to shear your hair, they're not going to grab the scissors and just start trimming the ends of your hair. They're going to grab the clippers, and hopefully it's got one of those guards on it, or you're going to look real close to my bald head uh, as could be. But my head's not shorn, my head is actually shaven. So shorn means to crop off close to the skin, as one of my second covering brethren has acknowledged. But to shave means to remove the hair completely. So the word shorn doesn't mean cut the hair. The word shorn means cut the hair short, as defined by Thayer's Greek English lexicon. So we've talked about the fact that Paul made the argument of logical conclusion, if a woman be not covered, let her also be shorn, and that shorn does not simply mean to cut the hair without reference to length, like trimming the split ends. Shorn, or the Greek word kero, means to cut the hair short. Now notice how the lexicons define the word kero. Abbott Smith, Manual Lexicon of the New Testament, to cut short the hair, shear a sheep, have one's hair cut off. So when Paul used the word caro in 1 Corinthians 11:6, he wasn't talking about simply trimming the hair. He was referring to cutting the hair short or cutting it off. As a matter of fact, that's the way the word is translated in many Bible versions. Thayer's lexicon says caro, to shear a sheep, to get or to let be shorn, absolutely of shearing or cutting short the hair of the head, 1 Corinthians 11:6. Zodiates' Complete Word Studies Dictionary of the New Testament. Caro, to shear, especially to shave the head. Then on 1 Corinthians 11:6, he says it indicates cutting the hair very short. So the context of 1 Corinthians 11:6 is, for if the woman trims or cuts her hair any length, she might as well cut her hair short. But since it is a shame for a woman to be cut short or shaven, let the woman not cut her hair at all. Everything in the context deals with the woman's hair. We have equality in both sides of the equation, both sides of the antithesis, and it is a logical argument of conclusion. As a matter of fact, even the translators of the New International Version recognize that 1 Corinthians 11 is talking about hair. 1 Corinthians 11 in the New International Version offers the following alternate translation in their footnotes of 1 Corinthians 11, 4-7. Now, the footnotes translate verse 6 in Greek as a cessative. 1 Corinthians 11, 4-7 in the NIV footnote translation says, every man who prays or prophesies with long hair dishonors his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with no covering of hair on her head dishonors her head. She is just like one of the shorn women. If a woman has no covering, let her be for now with short hair. And that's where they translate the Greek as a cessative. But since it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair shorn or shaved, she should grow it again. A man ought not to have long hair. So even the translators of the New International Version understand that the context of 1 Corinthians 11, 4-7 is talking about men and women's hair. In 1 Corinthians 11:13, Paul said, judge in yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God uncovered? This is the same Greek word Paul used in verse 5. This is a rhetorical question that Paul assumes his readers would commonly understand. So, in response to his own rhetorical question concerning whether or not it is proper for a woman to pray unto God uncovered, Paul answered with a statement concerning hair. Does not even nature teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a shame to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Now, I want you to get that. The climax of Paul's teaching as to the properness of a woman praying to God uncovered is that long hair is given to a woman for a covering. Thus, a woman's long hair fulfills the injunction of let her be covered. When a woman refrains from cutting or trimming her hair, she has fulfilled the apostolic biblical mandate of having her head covered. 1 Corinthians 11:15 says, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her. Now, in English, we think of this statement as a verb and a noun, long hair being a noun. But in Greek, it's not the case. The entire phrase, have long hair, is translated from one verb, kamao. Kamao in 1 Corinthians 11:15 is a present active verb in the subjunctive mood. This is referred to as the progressive present tense. When a progressive present tense verb is used in the subjunctive mood, it denotes a continuous action. Daniel Wallace, Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, page 518, says that the progressive present normally involves continuous action. Bill Mounts, Basics of Greek Grammar, page 289, calls the present continuous subjunctive. In other words, kamao, or have long hair, in 1 Corinthians 11:15, is talking about a woman allowing her hair to continuously grow long. The only way for a woman to allow her hair to continuously grow long is for her to have uncut hair. Kamao refers to the natural, uncut length of hair. You see, ladies, have long hair is not a number on a tape measure. When you allow your hair to continuously, without cutting it, continuously grow, if it only comes to your shoulders, it's still long hair. If it grows to the middle of your back, it's long hair. If it hangs to the ground and drags out your tracks, it's long hair. Have long hair refers to a woman allowing her hair to continuously grow without cutting it. Let me show you what the Greek dictionaries say about kamao, or have long hair. Notice that Bauer Danker lexicon defines kamao as wear long hair, let one's hair grow long. Thayer's lexicon says to let the hair grow, have long hair. Dr. Friedrich Prieseke, who was a German scholar of the Greek papyri, stated that the verb kamao means to wear one's hair uncut. His work is cited in Little and Scott, Bauer, and Moulton and Milligan, and a host of other Greek scholars. And notice that he defined the word kamao as wear one's hair uncut. And then Lou and Nita explain in their definition of kamao in 1 Corinthians 11:15 that in a number of languages it may be necessary to translate kamao as to let one's hair grow long, or not to cut one's hair. Now understand, Lou and Nita were not apostolic Pentecostals. So the idea that have long hair refers to uncut hair is not an exclusively apostolic Pentecostal view. In fact, most denominations used to preach this. Let me show you some commentaries from denominational preachers. The Schaff-Herzog Encyclopedia. Philip Schaff was a Presbyterian and Johann Herzog was a Swiss-German Protestant. Both of these men were translators of the American Standard Version, and they state that a woman's hair was never cut and long hair was the great ornament, and that they cite 1 Corinthians 11:15. Then John Gill, who was an English Baptist, his comments on 1 Corinthians 11:15 are, if a woman have long hair and wears it without cutting it, as men do. Dr. Philip Brown, who was a Wesleyan Methodist and is the professor of biblical languages at the Bible and Theology at God's Bible School and College in Cincinnati, Ohio. He cited on the use of the word kamao in early Greek literature, and then he gives the comment. Given that understanding, 1 Corinthians 11:6 would read, if a woman does not have uncut hair, then let her shear the rest off. But since it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her allow her hair to grow uncut. And then Paul Butler, who is from the Disciples of Christ or Christian Church, states, the expression long hair means let the hair grow. Hair is either natural length or not. We either let our hair grow or we don't. We either cut it off or we do not cut it. John Rice, who was an independent fundamentalist Baptist, he was the founding editor of Sword of the Lord magazine. Commenting on 1 Corinthians 11:15, he stated, God does not say how many inches long hair should be, but simply indicates that it should be left uncut. E.M. Zur, who was of the Churches of Christ Campbellites, he was a contributor to Truth magazine. He stated, by long hair, the Lord means hair that is long as nature makes it. If a woman cuts any of her hair, she also ceases to have long hair. So, this understanding that kama'o, or have long hair, refers to uncut hair is not exclusive to Oneness Pentecostals. Scholars of various denominations also understand that kama'o refers to long, uncut hair. We know for sure that a woman is not required to wear a veil because, in response to his own rhetorical question as to whether or not it is proper for a woman to pray unto God uncovered, Paul clarified that a woman's hair is given to her for a covering, or more specifically, instead of a veil. Most translators simply render 1 Corinthians 11:15 as her hair is given for a covering or as a covering. But these two prepositions have a wide semantic range. The preposition used in the Greek text is anti, which refers primarily to a replacement or an exchange instead of or in place of. Vine's expository dictionary defines the preposition anti. In the majority of the occurrences in the New Testament, the idea is that of in the place of, instead of, or exchange. The idea of substitution and exchange are combined. For example, in Luke 11:11, for a fish, a serpent. So in 1 Corinthians 11:15, where the hair is a substitute for the covering. G.B. Weiner's Grammar of the Idiom of the New Testament says ante, of which the local meaning is before, in front of, over, against, denotes figuratively barter, exchange, in which one thing is given for instead of another, and in consequence assumes its place. It governs the genitive, that being the case of exchange. For example, 1 Corinthians 11:15, her hair for instead of a covering to serve as a covering. So when a translation or a lexicon says for or as, it is talking about an exchange for as instead of. In fact, several translations render the passage as instead of or in place of. For example, the Apostolic Bible Polyglot says, for the hair of the head instead of a wrap is given to her. The Aramaic Bible in plain English says, because her hair is given to her in place of a covering. The International Standard Version says, since the hair is given as a substitute for a covering. The Darby translation says, for the long hair is given to her in lieu of a veil. The Orthodox Jewish Bible has, because the long hair has been given to her instead of the kerchief or a head covering. The R.A. Knox translation of the Latin Vulgate says that because of her hair has been given to her to take the place of a veil. So this passage teaches that nature has given a woman long hair instead of or to take the place of a veil. Let me give you a plain illustration of what 1 Corinthians means. Suppose someone asks you for $1. Maybe they want a snack out of a vending machine or something. So you reach into your pocket and you pull out 4 quarters. So you give this person 4 quarters for $1. So we could say that 4 quarters onto a bill are given to them. We could say 4 quarters for $1 bill are given to them. We could say that 4 quarters as $1 bill is given to them. We could even say that 4 quarters instead of a dollar bill are given to him. 4 quarters in place of a dollar are given to him. Or 4 quarters to serve as a dollar are given to him. In each scenario, 4 quarters have taken the place or assumed the place of a dollar bill. In every case, do you know what has been given to the person? 4 quarters. He hasn't been given 4 quarters and a dollar bill. He has been given 4 quarters for or instead of a dollar. Apply the same concept to 1 Corinthians 11:15. Long hair onto a veil is given to her. Long hair for a veil is given to her. Long hair as a veil is given to her. Long hair instead of a veil is given to her. Long hair in the place of a veil is given to her. Or long hair to serve as a veil is given to her. No matter how you translate it, just like with the 4 quarters, the scenario is the same. The woman's long hair assumes the place of the veil, and all that is required of the woman is what has been given to her, and that is long, uncut hair. Now, I want you to notice this, and I want you to think this through. In 1 Timothy 2:8-9, Paul said, I would therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands. In like manner also. So this connects the women to praying everywhere, lifting up holy hands. In the like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broided hair, or gold, or pearls, or costly array. Now notice that. Paul said not with broided hair. Well, why in the world is Paul concerned about a woman's hair during prayer time if supposedly first century Christian women fully covered their heads with a veil? Who would have been able to see her hair? How would Paul have known it was broided? The presence of a prohibition of such hairstyles argues forcibly that it was in fact being worn in churches, and that it was not only visibly, but it was seen by everyone. This in turn implies that there was not a doctrine of women wearing veils. Otherwise, how would Paul have known that women were wearing broided hair? And scholars contend that 1 Timothy was written about 10 years after 1 Corinthians. So apparently the women in Ephesus weren't wearing veils during prayer time, or Paul wouldn't have known that they had broided hair. Notice the parallel teaching of Peter, written some 13 years after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. 1 Peter 3:3, whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair. And this is once again in the context of the time of prayer, 1 Peter 3:7. Notice Peter called it the outward adorning. Now, how can plaiting the hair be an outward adorning if supposedly Christian women fully covered their heads with a veil? The point is, they didn't. If women went around praying with a veil over their head, then the veil would have been their outward adorning, not the plaiting of their hair. It wouldn't be necessary to warn against women wearing a particular hairstyle if their hair was being covered. This shows conclusively that apostolic women were not going around praying while wearing veils. Otherwise, why would Peter, the apostle to the Jews, have to prohibit against the outward adorning of plaiting the hair? So, in conclusion, Paul expounded that our hair is not only a natural distinction of gender, and boy, that's a whole other lesson right there. But you think about this. When Bruce Jenner wanted to identify himself as a woman, What were two of the first things he did? Number one, he grew his hair out long, and two, he put on a dress. But our hair not only signifies a natural distinction of gender, but it is also a symbol of our submission to our head. The man's submission to his head, Jesus Christ, and the woman's submission to her head, her husband. A man indeed ought not to cover his head because he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. Does not even nature teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair has been given to her for a covering. I thank all of you for listening to this exegetical sermon, and I thank you for the opportunity to expound what the Word of God teaches in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 concerning headship, head coverings, and hair. I hope this lesson has been a blessing to you. God bless.